All right. Hey, class, how's it going? So, we are here for Unit 9, Introduction to Humanities 2. And as I'm sure you can gather, we're starting to move through the modern world, and we are now on the brink and in the midst of World War One. And as I'm sure you can imagine, just based on the way in which we've been studying history and we're looking at how history impacts art and creative processes, something like a global war, especially world. Well, you can't say more so than World War II, but World War One was really the first of its kind, where there was killing on that scale, and there was the mechanization of death. This was something that, as I mentioned in my last intro lecture, was something very new. And if you think about the trend in modernism already, even before the war, was this feeling of a ruptured, disjointed modern world that was moving very quickly, and we were getting mechanization and we were getting new technologies and changing cities, and everyone was already feeling a little frazzled. And then you throw a global catastrophe on top of that already fractured feeling that people have, and it just pushed it even further. So this week we're gonna be taking a look, or this unit we're gonna be taking a look at World War One. I'm gonna give some of the course materials are gonna give you some context and some background about that, and then we're gonna jump into the literature and the art from this period and some of the impacts. So just as far as a timeline goes, just to give you an idea, we have World War One is going to hit in 1914-ish and then run until 1918. The scope of death that I have on a different slide here, but it's going to be about 40 million people. I mean, it is going to be huge. And then after World War One ends, we in the United States, we're going to roll right into the Roaring Twenties, and we're going to have a period, a little while before we get to the Great Depression, because you got to think in. So this war is going to wrap up in 1918. Let's just do a little timeline. So we're going to have 1914 right here, and we're just going to put that as the kickoff of World War One. And then let's just move this to the kickoff of World War II in 1940. And as you can see here, we're not looking at that many years. We're looking at, this 26-year period. And in this 26-year period, we're going to have the Spanish flu, which the Spanish flu, as we know from our current experience with COVID, is going to hit across the United States. We're going to have, in some places, even to this day, there are people hunting for mass graves from the Spanish flu. It's hit whitefish. There are mass debates in whitefish at this point. Some of the whitefish press has been featuring some of those old articles from 1918 through 1920. But the Spanish flu is going to hit young, healthy people disproportionately so. We know how with COVID, it tends to impact the elderly more aggressively. Well, oddly, the Spanish flu actually took out more young people than it did any other age demographic. People, I believe, in their kind of 20s and 30s were some of the hardest hit. So we have Spanish flu here, 1918 through 1920. Immediately following the war, we're going to immediately jump into the Russian revolutionist, or the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Bolsheviks. So we have the Russian Revolution. We're going to have German nationalism clouding this whole period, well, all the way through here. In the German nation state is going to go through a series of revolutions and turmoil. Basically, World War One is going to end, and Europe is going to be thrust into a very tumultuous period from 1920 to 1940. The United States, we're going to have at the same time as all this is going on in 1929, we're going to have the stock market crash, which is going to have ripple effects across the world. We're going to enter into the Great Depression. And then, along with the Great Depression here, we're also going to have the Dust Bowl in the Western United States. And the Dust Bowl was a massive environmental collapse and catastrophe as a result of one major drought, combined with some really poor farming practices that were just unknown at the time, and is going to lead to the mass migration of hundreds of thousands of families on the road looking for food in the midst of the Great Depression. So, and these are just to name, I mean, I'm only addressing a few of the hot button issues that are going to happen in this 25-year period. So this next chunk of our course, each unit is going to take different chunks of this all the way up to present day. Then we get into the 1940s, and then immediately we jump into the Cold War, and the march of history goes on. But this time period right in here, we're looking at this chunk in here, and we're going to call well, really, I'm going to say that modernism goes, this is the modern period, and goes all the way back into, we could just say 1900. I think that's pretty arbitrary, but we could say 1900 here for the beginning of modernism. So just once again, a lot happening. It's complicated stuff, and whenever we have a lot happening, it's complicated morally, intellectually, philosophically. The art follows right along. So the next slide here is what happens in terms of World War One. In the biggest thing that people start to do is they start to question, this concept that civilization is always improving, always getting better, that we talked about in the last unit, is really starting to be questioned, especially after, I mean, it's already being questioned, but then we throw World War One into the mix, and this idea of civil, and civilization is based on this term civil, and that we have civility for one another, and that we show civil deference for our family members and loved ones, and the sanctity of human life in some cases, these sorts of things. And oddly enough, the irony here is that it's also the last straw for divine right, feudalism, aristocracy, primogeniture, these sorts of things. When you look at the main players, France was in there, and the United States were in there. And we've talked a little bit about France's political history, but Kaiser Wilhelm, who's going to be the leader of Germany, King George of England, they were cousins, first cousins here. And you look at the Tsar Nicholas, the Emperor of Russia, also cousins with King George. So all of the people who are really the major players, at least initially, fueling this this war that's going to end up in the death of 40 million people. I'm not going to say it's entirely or solely their fault, but they hold a lot of responsibility. They all went into this very misguided, underestimating the potency of modern technology at the time, and not foreseeing the long lasting effects of their aristocratic hubris around that war would hold. And so, if we saw the fracturing going all the way back to the American and French Revolution, even back before that, the fracturing of this concept of divine right and feudal power structures being passed along, primogeniture meaning passing on to your eldest son, your progeny, passing your power and wealth and land to your progeny. This entire thing is going to absolutely shatter, and we're going to start to have Marxist revolutions, socialist revolutions, capitalist revolutions. We're going to have, after this, we are going to have revolutions like crazy. And in the case of the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Marxist Revolution, led by Lenin, it's going to be bloody. It's going to be ideological. It's going to completely shake up, political political standings, because the aristocracy up until World War One, although their power had been on the decline and it was diminishing, it would be absolutely wiped out. Um, there's a great book I read in the last few years called The Gentleman in Paris. And it's about this character who is a Russian aristocrat who is basically put under house arrest in a hotel in St. Petersburg, and he is there and witnesses the entire Russian Revolution locked in this hotel room over the series of years. But in many cases, the aristocracy, especially in the Russian Revolution, they were literally drug out into the streets and murdered right in the streets by the hundreds and thousands, hundreds and thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Some similar to the French Revolution in some ways. So it was these revolutions weren't they weren't tame by any stretch of the imagination. So as all this stuff is happening, the war, the post-war political instability, the ending of these traditions, art starts to ask some questions, and it's looking at 40 million people dead. I mean, it was hard for anyone in Europe not to know, and obviously the war was outside the scope of just Europe, into North Africa and into some of the British colonies, and Southeast Asia even played some roles in world minor roles in World War One, and it was into Turkey, and so it wasn't just Europe, but a large percentage of the dead ended up were coming from Europe. And so these European artists, and Europe had been the center of Western art, not all art, but Western art, they really start to deeply, deeply question, does tradition give us guidance? And, we're looking at this again, it's kind of like this question, moral guidance, because people are asking, where are our morals? What does it mean to be moral anymore? And, this tradition, if we look at this tradition of the ruling class, this obviously is no longer giving us any type of morals, this aristocratic family structure, and people, there's a major um, slide with religion towards science. So the moral center that the church had provided for a long time was not the same as what it used to be. People are looking to science, to science and our technological advancement, is that improving us? And people are saying, I don't think advancement is proving us, religion isn't proving us, traditional forms of government aren't improving us. We seem to actually be getting worse, if nothing else, as moral beings. And so this furthers those questions that we talked about in Unit 8, of that this modern world is the questioning of all things modern, all standards, all norms, all traditions. And this generation on both sides of the Atlantic, in the United States and into Europe, this entire generation is going to be referred to as the lost generation. And that is because they are morally lost. And it doesn't mean that they're all immoral or anything like that. It's just that they don't have any guideposts by which to frame their reference for the future. And so when you read poems like, oh, let's see, like William Butler Yeats is one poem that we're going to look at in this unit, The Second Coming. You should really start to see how these feelings come out in the poetry and the surrealism. And example I'm going to cover here a little bit is Dadaism. This is this kind of bizarre form of art that was actually defined by some as a revolt against art. Even art, when we were looking at the Romantic period and even the Realist period, those paintings were there to provide some type of moral commentary. I mean, even if you looked at the pictures of the slave ships, or the class structures and those people that were cast out into the ocean adrift, while the ruling class on the ship were in the lifeboats. That's a moral commentary that can give people some grounding and say, oh, well, of course that's not moral and this is moral. And so art had that ability to, and still does, in my opinion, has this ability to engage us, our morality, and anchor us culturally. I've always said that art is, let's say, is this mirror, and we'll put mirror here, and we look into the mirror, and then we see this mirror bounce an image back at us, and you know this mirror basically equals art, and the art asks us a couple of questions. Who are we? And this is, this collective question of who are we as a civilization, or as a people, or as a nation, any collective of people. Who are we, and who do we want to be? Meaning, do we like what we're seeing in the mirror? When we stand in front of that mirror and we look at it, do we like what we see? Who do we want to be? And Mark Twain, for example, we talked about this a few units ago. Mark Twain writes Huckleberry Finn, and he's asking these complex questions about the nature of race in the American South in the aftermath of the Civil War. He's holding up a picture that many people in the South were pretty deeply offended by, because he was saying, and he was a Southerner from a slave owning family, and he said, yeah, we have a pretty serious issue with race here, folks. Let's not ignore it. And so he brought it out, and that's what this art can do. And when we look at those other realist paintings, but now Dadaism is saying, yeah, no, screw it all. I don't care about art. Art doesn't mean anything. Nothing means anything. It's this absence of any kind of moral grounding, or moral centering. And so you can see here, this quote is great, and they're kind of prizing irrationality, chance, nonsense, absurdity. Nothing has to make sense. So here, for the first time, we're having mass marketed print media. Not for the first time, but for the first time on a mechanical scale, because of the mechanization that's occurring during the same time period. We have all this, cheap print. You would never go, even after the advent of the printing press, you would never go and just take a book and cut it up for art. And now, because there's all these flyers and handouts starting to pop up, because printing is slowly becoming mechanized, artists are starting to take some of this material, and photographs are starting to be reproduced in large scale reproductions. And people are taking these and they're just cutting them up and making these collages. Collages like this didn't exist previously, at least not in this artistic format, but it's just nonsense, like all this noise of the modern world tossed onto a piece of paper and glued together. And that's supposed to be what we see when we look in the mirror. So here, another and a more often accepted version was that Richard Hülsenbeck and Hugo Ball discovered the word while looking in a French-German dictionary. In French, Dada means hobby horse, and they chose it for its childness and naivety. Ball stated, "What we call Dada is foolery, foolery extracted from the emptiness in which all higher problems are wrapped." So for those of you who know your philosophy, you should start to think about nihilism and existentialism that will be coming towards the end of modernism. We're moving into those philosophical conundrums. So that's a brief overview of Unit 9. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you enjoy the material for this week.